What do you call it when a US president slaps a 50% tariff on Europe, and Europe fires back by torching a $43 billion Boeing deal, routing trade through Canada, and triggering a $2 trillion shift in global commerce? Not a dispute, a controlled breakup, while Washington brags about leverage and rants over steel and peanut butter. Brussels is cutting new deals, courting China and rewriting the rules without the US in the room. This isn't a warning, this is the exit. And by the time America looks up, it may already be locked out. A $43 billion aircraft deal just vanished. Trade with the US is unraveling and markets are reeling, but the question now isn't whether the US and Europe are in a trade war. It's whether the transatlantic alliance just collapsed under the weight of a 50% tariff on May 30th. President Trump declared negotiations with the EU going nowhere and called for an immediate 50% blanket tariff on all European imports starting June the 1st, including steel, aluminum, cars, agri-food and electronics. Within 48 hours, European stocks fell 2.1%, and Boeing faced the real possibility of losing its largest export contract on record. According to Bloomberg, the potential loss to US trade volume exceeds $2 trillion over the next decade if retaliatory EU measures materialize. Former EU negotiator Ignacio Garcia Berchero told Euronews, "If the US won't reverse course, Europe has no choice but to escalate. But what comes after escalation, Europe may already have the answer, and it's not across the Atlantic." The European Commission didn't hesitate in direct response to Trump's 50% tariff order, Brussels confirmed. It was finalizing a second retaliation package targeting $95 billion in US goods, while quietly moving to freeze a €43 billion Boeing aircraft. Deal Reuters reports that Ryanair's $30 billion order of 737 MAX jets is also now under review, with CEO Michael O'Leary stating that Boeing's rising costs are no longer sustainable. Meanwhile, Airbus surged 3.4% on the Frankfurt exchange, and China's Comac is suddenly in the conversation. An EU airline buying Chinese jets, once unthinkable, is now being modelled in Brussels trade forecasts. The US aerospace sector, already down 6.2% year-to-date on investor concerns over supply chain bottlenecks, now faces structural contraction. But the real danger: this wasn't just a response to tariffs, it was a trial run for what life without Boeing and without America might look like. When the EU slapped counter-tariffs on American staples like Harley-Davidsons, Levi's and peanut butter, it wasn't just optics, it was a direct hit on sectors tied to politically sensitive states. Harley's 2024 EU exports dropped 30% year-over-year, and the company is now projecting $145 million in lost revenue through Q3 2025. But it was American agriculture that took the sharpest blow. US farm exports to Europe plunged by $23.2 billion, according to the USDA Wisconsin-based dairy co-op Lando Lakes, cited immediate operational strain following the EU's hike on butter and cheese tariffs. Meanwhile, the US trade deficit hit a record $140.5 billion in early 2025, contradicting claims that tariffs would strengthen domestic output. As Bloomberg noted, tariffs meant to protect have instead exposed fragile dependencies. But the real pivot wasn't fiscal, it was geopolitical. The EU didn't just retaliate, it reoriented, while Washington burned diplomatic bridges. Ottawa built one under C-Day. The EU and Canada eliminated 98% of tariffs, creating a frictionless corridor now projected by the European Commission to facilitate over €90 billion in trade annually by 2026, with US tariffs driving up steel and auto prices by double digits. European firms like Siemens and Alstom have begun shifting procurement pipelines toward Quebec and Ontario. According to a May 2025 Financial Times report, Canadian EU clean tech trade rose 41% year-over-year, led by a 2 billion euro hydrogen deal signed at last year's EU-Canada Clean Technology Summit, and while the US shut itself out of climate-related funding, Canada offered open market access aligned with EU labour digital and environmental standards. Former Canadian Trade Minister Chrystia Freeland remarked, "In a recent Globe and Mail op-ed, what began as a free trade deal has evolved into a strategic partnership. But the most telling sign of the shift, Europe is treating Canada not as a neighbour of the US, but as its replacement. This isn't just a tariff skirmish, it's the unravelling of the Western trade consensus in just 10 weeks, a series of escalating duties from 10% on aluminum to 50% across the board have triggered retaliatory protocols, WTO complaints, and the potential voiding of at least 2 transatlantic mega-deals. The EU has suspended a €21 billion retaliation package until July 15th, but is preparing a second list targeting $95 billion in US exports pending the outcome of talks, according to CNBC. White House officials do not interpret Trump's posts as formal policy yet. European Commission spokesperson Olaf Gill stated publicly on June 2nd, "We are finalizing countermeasures that will take effect on July the 14th or earlier." In other words, even if a deal is theoretically possible, time is mathematically running out. And behind the numbers sits the deeper rupture. Washington is escalating. Brussels is realigning, and the deadline is now less about tariffs and more about who the EU chooses to depend on next. While the US escalated tariffs, the EU quietly shifted gears, pouring investment into clean tech and trade infrastructure to reduce American reliance. According to the Financial Times, EU-Canada clean energy projects jumped 41% in 2024, with a $1.2 billion earmarked for hydrogen and battery initiatives. The Clean Technology Summit, jointly hosted in Brussels and Vancouver, led to strategic agreements on solar component standardization, rare earth supply chains, and AI-driven grid infrastructure. Meanwhile, under its Repower EU initiative, the bloc committed to producing 20 million tons of renewable hydrogen annually by 2030, enough to offset nearly $60 billion in imported fossil fuels per Euroat data. What's quietly unfolding is not just diversification, but strategic insulation from US policy whiplash. And now, with clean power flowing through new diplomatic circuits, it's becoming clear Europe's next industrial pivot isn't led by Washington or Beijing. It's self-funded, cross-Atlantic, and pointed due north. If Ryanair exits its $30 billion Boeing contract, it would mark the first time a major EU airline selects a Chinese Comac jet over US-made aircraft, an outcome that once seemed inconceivable. But Bloomberg reports Ryanair executives are already in quiet talks with Comac, citing delivery delays and post-tariff price hikes of up to 14% on 737 MAX components. CEO Michael O'Leary warned that unless Boeing restores cost stability, all procurement options are on the table. A switch to Comac wouldn't just dent Boeing's balance sheet, it would legitimize China's entry into a Western-dominated industry, undermining FAA standard setting, influence and fragmenting global aviation compliance. Airbus may benefit in the short term, but a Comac breakthrough in the EU's low-cost carrier segment would signal a power transition that reshapes long-term aircraft certification norms. The question isn't whether this would hurt Boeing, it's whether it redefines who gets to write the future of flight. CETA wasn't a trade deal, it was a test run. And now Brussels is duplicating that model across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. According to EU trade data, negotiators have opened 17 bilateral talks since 2023, many modelled on the CEDA framework's zero-tariff labour aligned blueprint. The European Commission has quietly tied digital infrastructure funding to trade terms, offering joint investments in AI, semiconductors and fibre optic networks in Kenya, India and the UAE. While Washington remained fixated on tariff retaliation, In 2024 alone, the EU signed a $3.4 billion supply chain cooperation deal with India, fast-tracking non-dollar settlements in energy contracts. WSJ analysts note that Europe's trade strategy is shifting from defensive retaliation to structural repositioning, using CEDA as a prototype to dilute over-reliance on US logistics and arbitration systems. What began as a workaround to avoid tariffs has now evolved into a global framework, and the country's stepping into America's blind spot. They're not waiting for permission when Trump ordered 50% tariffs and dismissed the possibility of an EU deal. European leaders didn't negotiate. They pivoted. The European Commission is preparing to retaliate against $95 billion in US goods, while forecasts from Bloomberg Economics estimate US on EU trade could contract by $2 trillion over the next decade, if current barriers persist. This isn't economic turbulence, it's realignment. Airbus shares rose 3.7% in Frankfurt following the Boeing freeze. Canadian steel exports to Europe jumped 24% in Q1 2025. And CEDA's success has emboldened Brussels to fast-track 7 new trade compacts that exclude the US entirely. Former EU Commissioner Cecilia Malmström summarized the moment in a recent panel at the Bugle Institute. Decoupling isn't a threat, it's a plan. The US assumed tariffs would pressure Brussels into compromise, but with Europe building new trade corridors, empowering alternate suppliers and reducing transatlantic friction, the silence from Washington isn't leverage anymore, it's obsolescence. So now ask yourself, what happens if Boeing loses Europe, Comarmac wins credibility, and the US finds itself shut out of trade deals that span hydrogen chips and next-gen aviation? This isn't some geopolitical temper tantrum, it's a surgical pullout. Europe is unplugging from the US, one contract, one tariff, one partnership at a time. And while Washington hammers the same levers it's used for 30 years, Brussels is writing a different script, one that doesn't need American approval. So if this $2 trillion break was the wake-up call, then the next chapter, that's where the global order really changes. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Let's get to that. President Trump met with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on Monday. During the G7 summit, the two leaders reportedly committed to pursuing a trade deal within the next month. Prime Minister Mark Carney sending a clear and strong message to his country and to the White House as he prepares to lead his nation through a trade war that his country did not ask for once. Our land, our resources, our water, our country, never. But these are not idle threats. President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never ever happen. It began with a handshake in front of cameras. President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the G7 summit, announcing their intention to pursue a trade deal within a month. But what followed that carefully staged moment was a diplomatic collapse that few saw coming, because while Trump was promising progress, governors in the northeastern United States were already bracing for economic disaster. The warning signs weren't just in government offices. They were in empty hotels, vacant restaurants, shuttered storefronts, and on highways that until recently carried tens of thousands of Canadian tourists every month. Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey had seen enough. I thought it was important to get a group of us together, so I invited Governor Hochul from New York, the other New England governors, to meet with Canadian premiers in Boston the other day to talk about how we can move forward with our own relationships, our own partnerships around trade, around energy supply, around tourism. For example, as Trump escalated tariffs on Canadian goods, raising them to 25% on energy, lumber, and aluminum. Healey called an emergency meeting, not in D.C., not with diplomats, but in Boston, with governors, with premiers, with the people actually feeling the pain. Before we continue, hit that like button to help us beat the YouTube algorithm and to show your support. The gathering was unprecedented. Governors from across New England, New York, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, sat across from Canadian provincial leaders. No cameras, no pomp, just the urgent question, how do we protect our local economies, while the federal government drags us into a trade war with our closest ally? Canada is our biggest trading partner, Healy said bluntly, and Trump is taxing our states like they're the enemy. Her voice was calm. Her data was not Massachusetts had already seen a 20 to 60% drop in Canadian tourism, and it was only June hotels were reporting record cancellations. Flights from Canada into Boston's Logan International were plummeting. Canadian homeowners in Florida were fleeing the state, and some of the wealthiest tourists in North America were voting with their wallets. The impact was not theoretical, it was personal, and it was devastating. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button to show your support to the channel. This is not just about politics, Healy said. This is about workers, families, business owners getting laid off because Canadians are cancelling trips, pulling out of seasonal homes, and avoiding our cities entirely. And they were in Old Orchard Beach, Maine, a town just 150 mi from the Canadian border. Sterling Moore stood inside the point of view in staring at his empty reservation book. The Canadian side was gone. Morse had been welcoming French-Canadian families for decades. Same families, same weeks, same rooms. Not this year. We're down 90%. Morse said they're angry and they're not coming. He pulled out a box of registration cards from the previous year, Canadian flags on almost everyone. Then he held up this year's stack empty. This doesn't pay the bills, he said quietly. This doesn't work. The trigger wasn't hard to find. Trump had repeatedly mocked Canadian leadership. He called Prime Minister Carney a glorified governor, joked about making Canada the 51st state, and insisted that Canadians had been ripping us off for decades for people like Gary and Carol Cruz. Snowbirds, who had visited the United States for 5 months a year for over a decade. The shift was emotional. We love America, Gary said. We've spent over $30,000 a year on US vacations, but this, it feels like a gut punch from a best friend. The Cruzes had cancelled 2 trips to Disney this year alone. Their RV, normally parked somewhere between Florida and Arizona, by spring would now stay in Ontario. We used to look for Made in the USA labels, Carol said. Now, if we see that, we put it back on the shelf, and they weren't alone. State tourism boards in Florida, New York, California, and Illinois were launching targeted ad campaigns, begging Canadians to come back. Please visit. One California ad read, "We're not Trump." Another featured images of peaceful coastal towns with the caption, "We're still your neighbors." But Canadians weren't buying it, because even if a destination was politically welcoming, crossing the border still meant going through Trump's America. It meant passports, flags, questions. And for many, that was reason enough to stay home back in Massachusetts. Healy was tallying the broader impact. Lumber tariffs had raised the cost of construction so dramatically that affordable housing projects across the state were freezing. In place, we get almost all of our lumber from Canada, she explained. Now we're paying more to build fewer homes. The math doesn't work. Aluminum tariffs hit another industry hard. Beer. Massachusetts has one of the largest craft brewing sectors in the country. Every can. Canadian aluminum, we're seeing layoffs. Healy said, we're seeing production slowdowns. We're seeing good businesses get punished for a trade war they didn't ask for. Then came energy. Trump's tariffs on Canadian natural gas and electricity imports were projected to raise heating and utility costs across New England by $2.5 billion over the next 5 years. That's a tax. Healy said, a Trump tax on working people. It wasn't just Democrats saying it. Republican governors from border states were seeing it too. Lost tourism, increased energy costs falling, housing starts, rural hospitals shuttering. And it was all coming faster than anyone had predicted in Boston. Healy laid out what she called a regional response governors would pursue. Energy partnerships with Canadian provinces directly. They would negotiate cross-border tourism packages, explore rail link projects, and seek waivers for critical infrastructure materials like lumber and aluminum. If Trump can't get it together with Carney, she said, then we will. But that didn't stop the damage already underway. The Massachusetts hospitality industry had taken a direct hit. Waitstaff, bartenders, housekeepers, all facing hours reductions and layoffs. And the ripple effect was massive. Supply chains, disrupted beverage distributors reporting unsellable stock craft beer cans stacking up in warehouses, and all of it tied to tariffs. And for every politician offering a press conference, there were real people losing their livelihoods. Even the Chamber of Commerce in Old Orchard Beach admitted that Canadian tourists made up 30 to 40% of annual revenue for dozens of local businesses. This doesn't just affect tourism, the director said. It affects food service, retail real estate, auto sales. It's systemic. Meanwhile, Trump was silent. No clarifying message, no signal of a walk back, no diplomatic outreach. Instead, governors were left trying to do